Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar. I can see we've got some people rolling in and starting to join us. We will just give it a few more moments for everybody to log in before we get started. Good morning for everybody who's just joined us. We will get started very shortly on this morning's webinar. Just give it a few more moments for some others to join us this morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar, where we are looking at Smart PPE and other digital monitoring technologies. We just have a few points of housekeeping to go through before we get into this morning's session. First off, this is a listen-only webinar and it is being recorded. While you won't be able to interact with us verbally or vocally, we do welcome questions via the Q&A chat function. And we will be answering your live questions at the end of this webinar, so please do make use of the Q&A function and post your questions. You don't have to wait till the end of the session to post your questions. Please do post as we go along and we will get to answering them at the end. Also, if you do have any technical difficulties, please also use the Q&A chat function and one of our team will try and help you out as soon as they can. Lastly, for everyone that attends this webinar, we will follow up with a feedback survey after today's session. So please do fill that out, let us know what you think, help us make this content even better next time. And once you've completed the survey, you will have access to today's slides, as well as access to a recording of the session. So without further ado, we will get started for today. So this is the first of 3 webinars we're running today for occupational health and safety management, looking at emerging trends and current priorities. We've got a really interesting session planned and it's great to see so many people have joined this morning. And we have 4 panelists joining us today. So if I could just ask our 4 panelists to please switch on your cameras, we will get introduced. Great. So first, with myself, my name is Lachlan Humphreys. I am the Committee Manager to BSI's National Committee HS1 on Occupational Health and Safety Management. We look after the national development for the 45,001 family of standards. So joining us today, as you can see, we've got 4 panelists, and I'll go to Kate Field first. If you could introduce yourself, please, Kate.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. My name is Kate Field. I'm Global Head of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at BSI. And my role is really to help and support our clients and the wider stakeholders on their occupational health and safety journey towards best practice.
Great, thanks very much, Kate. And Bryn?
Good morning on this cold and frosty morning, but bright morning. I'm Bryn Sutton. I'm the Global Director for BSI's Life Protection Practice, product testing and certification, and I oversee numerous practices with the kind of aim to ensure that products enter markets across the world, both safe and useful for both employees and businesses.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Bryn. And David Mudd, if we could go to you next.
Good morning, everyone. David Mudd, I'm the head of digital trust within the assurance business. So that's looking at aspects of digital governance and risk management, cybersecurity, privacy, data, artificial intelligence, and digital supply chains. Again, supporting our clients really on the long and complex journey to a smart, secure, and sustainable digital future.
Excellent, thank you very much, David. And last but not least, Chris Tidy.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Hope you're keeping well. Yeah, it's a bit chilly this morning, but I'm Chris Tidy, Director of a specialist training consulting company, and I look after, on behalf of the UK and the BSI, and work on some standards, mainly predominantly head protection, but I also work in electrical standards as well.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So today we are looking at smart PPE and other digital monitoring technologies, specifically in an occupational health and safety management context. As you can see, and you've just heard, we've got a really knowledgeable panel who are very keen to share their thoughts and insights today. And it will be more of a discussion-based session this morning. So a little bit further on in this morning's session, we'll get into some questions and all of our panelists will have a chance to answer those. But before we get into it, we thought we would set the scene a little bit and just go over what we're actually talking about when we're talking about some of these technologies. So to do that, I'm going to quickly hand over to Chris Tidy to give us a short presentation.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Yeah, so I just wanted to really sort of set the scene and give you an idea of what sort of smart PPE is. You know, how does it work? Is it safe? What possibilities could you have possibly with smart PPE? So basically, in a nutshell, smart PPE is that sort of smart wearable type of system. Could connect to the internet. I don't believe that every single piece of smart PPE is exactly electronic. There are other types of smart PPE out there that give you sort of smart protection in terms of head protection and smart sort of indicators that could indicate impact on head protection as well. So it's not all electronic, but predominantly it's sort of devices that connect, like software or mobile phones, to deliver obviously that sort of real-time safety. It's a PPE obviously that can minimize exposure to hazards. We've seen sort of indicators that can go onto helmets or wearable indicators that don't allow you in specific areas and things like that. So it could then send a notification. Generally, 9 times out of 10, there's a software that sort of sits in the background and gathers data. Sometimes it's not always a big software program. Sometimes it can be something as simple as, say, an NFC tag that is in a piece of wearable PPE or equipment that can monitor or track obviously where you are, and then you sort of ping it over with the phone and it could download some information and things like that. There's some other really intelligent stuff that automatically adjusts to internal and external conditions. So there's all sorts of sort of smart wearable PPE that's actually out there in the marketplace at the moment, and some that's obviously up and coming. If you could do the next slide for me, please, that would be great. Thank you very much. So we've gone over some of these already. What are the typical uses? So predominantly a lot of smart PPE has been attached to helmets. There's sort of smart lookout, tag out sort of systems. Laser enabled emergency stop devices can obviously prevent equipment related injuries as well. There's environmental sensors, which obviously we went over just previously. Originally on helmets, there was a company that introduced like a UV sort of indicator that showed when the helmet had been exposed to a large amount of UV. So that's some of the early types of tech, but of course, as that's sort of gone forward, it's become more electronic based and can monitor obviously gas levels, any chemicals, heat, sound levels, obviously for hearing protection as well, and alert supervisors, particularly in hearing protection. It can then establish obviously an area where there's a particular noisy environment, and then obviously adjust levels of decibel protection in those particular areas. So there's all sorts of smart stuff out there. Cooling and heating elements, because obviously these days, you know, we have global warming, as you know, so there's a lot of more activity around heat stress and things like that. Of course, we're going to get cold snaps like we do have now, so there's an emphasis obviously on cold stress, which is an actual thing as well, and obviously that's designed to keep the wearers safe. And light emitting garments like safety vests, obviously, which a lot of people actually use at the moment and provide some sort of high visibility. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, does it work and is it safe? Now that's you know, that's a great question, because you know, technology. Just before I came onto this webinar, I had an extreme system crash where all of my microphone went off and you know, the cam wasn't working. So you know, technology isn't absolutely foolproof, and obviously things can go wrong. So there is quite a steep learning curve when it comes to technology, and obviously for us to learn and understand how it works, and then when it does go wrong, how we can actually put it right. So there's definitely a lot of learning and understanding around technology, so definitely a steep learning curve. Of course, when people's lives are in danger, we need to know that the technology is going to work without a shadow of a doubt. And as I established earlier, you know, with my technology, sometimes it just doesn't work. So, you know, when people's lives are in danger, it's always good to obviously think about a backup to make sure, just in case. Of course, there's the issue of data, which we'll go into a little bit more later. Obviously, some sensitive information may be contained within there. And of course, at the moment, there is some sort of prohibitive pricing that causes an issue. So smaller companies like tier 2 and tier 3 contractors may not be able to afford smart PPE because it is, you know, or can be quite expensive. There obviously are systems that are not as expensive, like the NFC sort of tracking and tagging type of systems, but ultimately there is a cost that is involved to it, and it's whether it's, you know, reachable for those sort of lower tiers. If we could do the next slide, please. So these developments in smart PPE are obviously extremely promising. I've always been a great advocate of looking at smart PPE and all the different things that we can do with smart PPE and where it actually takes us. But you know, there's lots and lots of things out there, like the smart helmets, the hearing protection, the environmental monitoring, that have been out there actually for quite some time. But there's been some vast improvements of actually, you know, how that actually works with the sort of introduction of private networks, so aerial systems that, you know, can be put up to establish a private network. But you know, I go back sort of, you know, a few years when I first sort of investigated Smart PPE, and we'd put a man down function into like a two-way radio, and you know, we thought, wow, that's going to be fantastic. But when the guys or girls sat down, you know, to have something to eat and leant backwards very slightly, you know, the man down function would go off and there'd be an alert and sort of everyone would go there, you know, what's happened. But so there are, you know, some sort of restrictions when it comes obviously to Smart PPE. But as I said, you know, things have got better without a shadow of a doubt, but it's always, you know, very difficult. And we have to think about what our customers, what the wearers actually want. So what do they want the Smart PPE to do? It's really great going out and inventing a load of Smart PPE, but it's not very good if it's actually not what the market actually requires. So, you know, producers of Smart PPE have to actually think about that. And of course, it does improve or can improve, you know, worker productivity, and obviously help to, you know, aid and prevent injuries. Next slide, please. So yeah, looking at the market and Smart PPE, it is going. There has been a surge in demand, obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly in the healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry, where there was a sudden surge. But the global Smart PPE technology market is projected to grow from 3.13 billion in 2021 to about 9.05 billion in 2028. So it's not you know, a massive sort of increase, but it is growing. And there's a lot of companies and customers out there that have a desire for Smart PPE. But hey, look, for me, you know, we have to get the fundamental basics right before we actually, you know, think about introducing Smart PPE. You know, I spoke with a customer a few months ago, and they were taking part in my what I do every year is something called Hard Hat Awareness Week. And they were taking part in that, and they just went out and decided that they'd, you know, check their inventory for their safety helmets being out of date, and they found that 50% of them, you know, were actually out of date. So hey, you know, while Smart PPE is absolutely fantastic, I'm a massive advocate for it going forward, we have to get also the fundamental basics right as well, and we need to think about that. So thank you very much. That's my introduction to Smart PPE.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a great introduction and full of loads of examples. I think we've just got quite a few things that I think our panelists will probably want to come back to as we go forward. And we are going to open it out to our panelists now with our first discussion question, which is around the benefits of using Smart PPE and other digital technology and digital monitoring technologies. So we've obviously just had an overview of Smart PPE from Chris, but we haven't touched too much on digital monitoring technologies yet. So I might go to Kate first, if I can, to just give us a bit of an idea of what we're talking about with digital monitoring technologies and what kind of things are already being used in workplaces.
Great, thank you. And I'm very honoured to be on a panel with such experts, and I'm sure David will have additional comments to say in terms of digital monitoring. But I think the sorts of things that we're starting, so we've talked about Smart PPE. So the digital monitoring technologies that we're starting to be seen are as varied as the PPE uses that Chris has already examined. So from an occupational health and safety point of view, some of the technology that we're seeing being used is smart vision. So where AI is being used with CCTV systems, for instance, to identify whether there are hazard or risk issues, whether personnel are moving into areas that they shouldn't. So alternatives to maybe GPS systems that monitor where people are. We're seeing a lot of those sorts of uses, so that smart vision technology. We're also seeing, and particularly with the rise of remote working for some organisations, digital monitoring being used in terms of, so if you watch everybody's eyes, so again, using smart vision to see where people are looking as a way of monitoring whether they are focused on their computer and working, or whether they are focused somewhere else. There's also, monitoring that's actually been around for a long time in terms of, again, logging in at the beginning of a day, logging out, activity on a computer system, again, to see whether you're working. And there's a whole range of now that's coming through. I think some that have some really positive benefits, some that I think have some areas that we need to understand what the potential risks and concerns are with that. But we've also seen some really interesting use cases from organisations like Google. They had a really interesting use case where they were looking at the role of line managers and whether there was value in having line managers, and if there was a value in having line management, what skills and capabilities that they needed. And they actually use artificial intelligence to scan email correspondence between existing line managers and individuals to review complaints and concerns. And through that analysis, what they established was that actually line managements were critically important, but there were certain skill sets, particularly things like high emotional intelligence, empathy, that were critical to those roles. And out of the back of that work, they then developed a comprehensive in-house training program to develop line managers that were going to maximize the opportunities for that role. So it's hugely varied, it's changing almost daily in terms of use cases, but they're just a few examples.
Thanks very much for that, Kate. I might go to David next. Would you like to kind of build on what Kate said and think a little bit about the benefits of both the digital monitoring technologies, but maybe also smart PPE as well?
Yes, thanks. And I think Kate's brought in a really interesting dimension there, looking at that broader digital monitoring. As Chris has already said, when we're looking at smart PPE, it's first and foremost, it's got to be effective PPE and the smart technology onto it. And there are issues there, I think, around trust and reliability and cost around that. But a combination potentially of these digital technologies of smart PPE and digital monitoring gives a huge capability, but you've got to think, what is it we're actually trying to do? Where's the return on investment and where's the real benefit? And I think this comes in two kind of dimensions, really. First of all, you think of it as doing what we already do, but doing it better versus doing new things. So optimization versus transformation. And there's lots that we can do focusing on improving what we do already. And that's the low hanging fruit to think of when with the ROI, but also try to think of what totally new use cases, what does it allow us to do something totally different as well? And that's the area yet to be explored, I think, where there's a lot of the return on investment can come from. But it's got to start with that that optimization of doing what we do now. So more reliable, predictive failures, this kind of thing, rather than waiting for things to fail, and generally making things safer. And then the other key dimension really on that return on investment is we tend to focus on the immediate. It tells you the situation for one particular individual and one particular instance, or the instantaneous status of the equipment. But the massive advantage comes from all the data that you start to collect. Every time there's any kind of activity or incident or anything, there's a vast amount of data. And this data gives insight into trends that go way beyond the equipment itself, looking at trends overall of risks within the workplace, risks within that work environment. And that massive amount of insight, that takes it to another whole level. So I think we need to think of, yes, the immediate real-time use and improvements and benefits, but getting right across the industry, if everything was connected there, the insight that we would have and the improvements to working practices would be astronomical. I think that's where we've got to look at the real long-term benefits. So not just the instantaneous now, but that massive amount of data and information we will get from that.
Thanks very much, David. And I know we're definitely going to come back to some of those points about data further along in the webinar. But I think it's a good point to bring in Bryn at this moment. Would you like to give us some thoughts on the benefits?
Yeah, and I'm going to come away from the kind of technological benefits or the monitoring sort of consistency that Smart PPE can bring, and just ask people to kind of reflect. You know, the World Health Organization suggests that 2 million people are dying at work through work-related injuries, and in the UK there's 60,000 injuries reported as residual, of which almost 9,000 are about the prospect of not wearing PPE or incorrectly wearing PPE. So if we go back to some real basic stuff that, you know, you remove hazards at source and PPE is your last line of defense, traditional PPE needs to work smarter. So there is this question about artificial intelligence and the huge benefits it can bring, or the huge concerns on the principal agent theory of trust as we remotely work. But when you're a worker in a situation and you're relying on that PPE as your last line of defense, Smart PPE can really enhance that world by allowing employers and employees to talk sensibly about the monitoring issues. So, for example, if people are provided PPE and they are simply not wearing it, how can we encourage those people to do so? Why do we need to spend lots of money on trying to police working environments when actually data can tell us exactly what we need to know? And that data is innate, really. I mean, if you have a piece of PPE and you're not wearing it in this context, then, you know, employers want to ensure that you're safe. So there's a kind of really futuristic view of Smart PPE, and there's something in the now. You know, if you're wearing ear defenders, for example, how do you know that in each environment that you're wearing that is acting effectively? What warning systems or data can that provide to tell you that the decibels have increased or safety has decreased? And ongoing monitoring of sound or moving objects or falling from height. These are all things that could be brought into Smart PPE traditionally now. So one of the things we've got to ask ourselves, because there is no clear definition at this stage of Smart PPE, is what could it simply mean in an agile perspective? Is it traditional PPE with data that can then be used to enhance the safety of the environment? So we've got this predictive intelligence side, and I think we've got this safety side. And as Chris said, you know, it's a steep learning curve, but if we treat this product in the agility that it needs to perform, then we could start with some really simple on-the-market products that are happening now to improve that safety. What I would say is missing is trust and assurance. You know, most of these people come from an innovation perspective in this new environment. So, you know, investors and people within organizations need that go-to trust and assurance. And that can only come at this particular point in areas like standards.
Thanks very much, Bryn. And again, I think you've raised a few things that we're certainly going to come back to a little later on in the webinar. But a particularly interesting point, I think, about traditional PPE, what's available now compared to the very long lens approach and all the things that might be possible in the future. So I might just go back to Chris. Did you have anything you wanted to add on benefits for either Smart PPE or digital monitoring technologies?
No, not really. I think I agree with all the panelists. I think there's some brilliant points, but you know, for me, there'll be a lot of education around it as well, and a lot of people will need to understand its limitations as well as obviously what, you know, what it sort of can do. And what I find, you know, there is a distinct lack of education around lots of things, and the reason why even that we wear PPE without it even being smart, you know. So there is a challenge definitely there. There is a benefit, but there is also a challenge in terms of educating and getting people to actually, you know, understand what the benefits actually are. But you know, a lot of people don't even understand what the benefits are of wearing a safety helmet and the reasons why they've got to wear a safety helmet, you know. So it is, you know, I've spent a long time, you know, educating and trying to get people to understand my area of expertise, which is obviously the head injury and brain injury side of it. And I see that Smart PPE is definitely an addition to that, without a shadow of a doubt. And Bryn's exactly right. There are, you know, there are things that are out there now which could help massively, but have they been developed specifically for that? Or are they developed for, you know, for something else, but end up being shoehorned into that? And we have to be very, very careful that when a company approaches us and says, you know, we do a smart PPE and it can do this, this, and this, that we make sure as users, wearers, that it can physically do those things and give you those things, but also that we understand what it actually does and its limitations as well. So certainly, yeah, education without a shadow of a doubt is key in everything that we do from a PPE perspective, and particularly will be with Smart PPE as well.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. And I think that leads quite nicely into our next discussion question, if we could go to the next slide. So we've just been having a think about the benefits of using this kind of technology. So now we'll kind of think about the other side of it, and some of the risks and hazards. So I might go to David first. You mentioned under the benefits banner, you know, the possibilities of having such a large amount of data. I wonder if you want to pick up on that as far as a risks and hazards perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And so there are, again, a couple of dimensions to this. The first thing is that we talk about Internet of Things here, connected devices, and most Internet of Things manufacturers are the thing, not the internet part, particularly I think in areas like this. So they're very, very heavily dependent on their supply chain for the technology that goes into these devices. And as we've already heard, the other side of it, sometimes you get a lot of great innovation with products coming out there saying, we've got a great idea for this. And what tends to happen in this area is security isn't high on the agenda. They want to get some functionality there, prove that something basically works. And if security isn't considered at the beginning, particularly with IoT and smart devices versus, say, your phones, tablets, or laptops, then there isn't necessarily the budget in terms of processor power, memory, communications bandwidth, as well as cost, to add security afterwards. So the lack of security by design in the Internet of Things space has meant that there are billions of insecure devices out there. And this, what we've seen through the pandemic is a huge acceleration in the adoption of digital technologies. But everything that can be used for good can be used for bad. So just as we see, you know, it's now as an organization, you can have platforms as a service, and, you know, whether we're using Office 365 rather than having downloaded, you know, server client models, and everything's on the platform, it's all very easy and accessible. You can buy ransomware as a service. You don't even need to create it yourself. So the technologies to get out in there and deny service, yeah, they are now just as prevalent. We've seen that industrialization of cybercrime. And quite often, all too often, in fact, insecure IoT devices are then become zombies that are controlled by these bad guys and used in these denial of service attacks. So you get devices that are designed to help people be secure and all this kind of thing, and they actually become part of the attack vector. If you connect a new device to the internet, it will be attacked in 5 minutes. This isn't now some guy sitting there looking and hacking. This is like vast amounts of full automation out there looking for devices to be attacked. And what could be the risks here? Well, we've mentioned around the hazards in terms of the PPE not functioning, but also personal data. And personal data, you think, okay, if it's you can have data that's direct and obvious. It's going to be your bank account details and all that as well. But if it's data that can be inferred as associated to a particular person, so just by the username and then your location and where you are, what you've been doing when, all of that becomes sensitive personal data. All of that becomes a huge target. So the key, for me, the key thing here is that all that great digital technology can be used for bad as well as used for good. IoT is a prime target vector. This is why security by design is so important. So I can go on to the solutions, but probably will hang on and let other people talk around the threats, because the other key thing is I don't want to be scaremongering here. There are good solid solutions and good ways forward, but we have to acknowledge that if you connect something to the internet, you will be attacked, and security should be right up there in that initial design phase, not an add-on.
Thank you very much, David. I'd like to go to Bryn now, just to pick up on your previous answer, Bryn. We were talking about kind of the function of adding functionalities to existing PPE versus the kind of bigger possibilities. So what do you think, if we're thinking about if you are integrating something with existing PPE, what are the kind of risks and hazards that might be involved in that?
Again, I'm looking at it from the context of life promotion and kind of weighing the balance of risks. Where do your concerns lie? Do we concern ourselves with increasingly protecting the workforce or saving life, or going for an agile journey of managing our technologies correctly? So I think both are really, really important, but from a risk perspective, I guess for employers, what is the risk of not having, in a world of available additional data, using that to protect your workforce in the future? That's one risk to consider. I mean, from a product perspective, the product has to work post-traditional testing. So when we test a piece of PPE, it needs to work in its environment. And the IoT element needs to work after all of that's happened. And I think there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think there's early, agile, real green shoots. You know, I am in a position, for example, to take products from innovators or mature organisations, understand their claims, understand the risk of those claims, and potentially test in the environment to give some trust and assurance in the market, because that, again, is where the risk lies. If people are scared to buy these products, as David says, the fear side of it, then will we ever get the benefit? And the risk is organisations like us trying to help people through sensible journeys with the end result of promoting life and increasing safety or occupational well-being. So the fallback position has always got to be whatever the product was intended for must be its first go-to position. And if we go more simpler and don't look at predictive AI, and we look at IoT as our starter platform, the ability to give data, if the data fails, and the only claim that product makes is that the data is enhancing the workplace, in my opinion, it will always work as a piece of PPE. So the disaster never occurs. The person is safe, what fails is the data. And as David quite rightly said, we then need to manage that risk of the data through cyber security. And again, by combining two very key points in the trust and assurance world, I think we're in the ability now to start investigating some of these simple problems.
If I can just add to that as well, like I did to say, what we can also do here is learn from other sectors, other areas that have been through this, in other critical areas that we've been working on, such as emergency lighting, for instance, where, you know, again, number one thing is that's got to work as emergency lighting, and the smart technology isn't got to be an add-on to it. The way the technology worked first was one-way communication only. So it's giving data, and that can help support a whole load of great things. But if anything happens, there is no way in for the attacker to stop that emergency lighting acting as an emergency light. So again, that's been the most easy way to put that top level protection in. And this has been a mantra right way through IoT for me. An Internet of Things thing is first and foremost a thing. and it has to do that above anything else. So what Bryn's saying there is absolutely right, and there is precedent from other you know, life critical areas that within Smart PPE we can learn from to say, okay, this is how it's worked successfully before, so we don't have to go through that pain. So the precedent is there, and there are clear ways forward to take Bryn's approach of, well, let's just start with the basics here about what we can do with the technology that's there now to help support better use of that technology through kind of data and signaling without getting to the complications of kind of interactive dynamic PPE, smart PPE and all that. There's more we can do now that avoids that risk. And that will also, Bryn, take the other point then, start to build that trust once people start to see there are benefits here and it's low risk.
Thank you very much, David and Bryn. Lots of good points well made there. I want to bring in Chris, if I can, now. So Chris, you spoke a little bit about education in the previous answer. So could you pick up a little bit on risks and hazards from that perspective?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, there's, you know, there's always obviously going to be risks and hazards associated with the use of smart PPE, whether that be through, you know, data, whether that be through whether it works, you know, correctly, especially if we're looking at something where someone's life might be in danger and they're obviously reliable on that piece of smart technology to actually work properly. But hey, yeah, there is obviously a risk as well that we put something out there from a smart or a digital monitoring technology, and that people just don't understand how it works, what it does, what the infrastructure is, what's in the background, what's supposed to be working in the background. So you know, that's why I said originally it's quite a steep learning curve, because there is a lot to understand. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, I sometimes, you know, I may sound sort of slightly negative, but I'm not. I'm very positive about smart PPE, and I'm very positive about the future and where it can actually take us. But certainly what I've seen of the technology now, which works, you know, exceptionally well, there is still a lot to learn and understand about it. But there's other things to need to learn and understand as well. So it's, yeah, so it's important. There definitely obviously are hazards and risks without a shadow of a doubt. But part of that definitely is, look, you know, there needs to be a solid education platform that goes in with any smart PPE that's put in mass into an area, you know. So there, if I take my example that I said with the man down function and that going off, you know, the risk obviously was that people were attending to someone that obviously there was nothing, you know, actually wrong with them. The same risk occurred when we wanted to track someone that was actually inside a building, and we used Bluetooth beacons to sort of ping the positioning of that person. But that again wasn't, you know, completely infallible. At that time when that was introduced, we didn't have sort of private networks, so we were using Bluetooth technology to sort of ping off, which, you know, at the time was version 1 or version 2 and wasn't particularly, you know, absolutely brilliant at pinpointing people's locations. So people would be sent to the wrong location to aid someone, and actually they were, the person that needed the help was in a different location. So there are obviously hazards and risks, and you know, nothing is, you know, when it comes to technology, is absolutely infallible. And you know, if you're like everyone on this planet, to make my computer work, I just turn it off and turn it on again, you know. But sometimes with smart PPE systems, complete systems, you know, that reboot, you don't want to be doing that all of the time, you know. And so you've got to make sure that it's working, and it's working correctly. You know, that's the most important thing. But obviously, educate people as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. And again, full of examples there, which is really, really great. And I do want to make sure we get to Kate on this question as well. So there are also psychological factors to consider with some of these technologies, especially on the digital monitoring tech side of things? So Kate, do you want to come in on some risks and hazards there?
Yeah, so I'll actually start with Bryn's point and thinking about the basics when it comes to PPE. And, you know, the fundamentally, you know, is it protecting what in the way it needs to protect? Does it fit the wearer? There are still huge issues with the design of PPE to meet the diversity of workforces. So, you know, does it actually fit? And I think you know, some of the other things that we need to think about with smart PPEs, the challenges that we see with PPE anyway, you know, is it being kept clean? Can it be cleaned? How quickly is it being replaced? Where is it being stored? You know, there are really fundamental issues that are a challenge for PPE generally. But if we start adding in, for instance, you know, some electronic data, some chips, then actually, does that mean that you can't clean the PPE, or is it removable before you clean it? You know, some real basics. And I think, you know, there are also challenges in terms of, you know, some of the technology that is being used might change the weight of the PPE, so there might be ergonomic issues in terms of increasing the weight and the balance. So that, I think that's an area that needs to be considered and thought about. So, you know, all the aspects that we know about PPE and the way it's worn, the cleaning of it, the keeping of it, apply even more so, I think, to smart PPE, and we're assuming that, you know, there's a straight link between, and I don't think there is. But I think in terms of the psychological, this is really important and just kind of completely overlooked, I think, overall by a lot of organisations. People are very nervous about being monitored all the time. It's an indication that an organisation doesn't trust workers. And you know, and a really good example of this has happened, you know, because of the pandemic. We were in this situation where we were all in lockdown, where organisations were maybe more service-based and they could go from working in the office to working online. We had this increase in trust for the workforce because suddenly everybody was working at home and there were no kind of questions asked. We all just got on and did it. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. This is this huge shift change in terms of actually organisations, employers trusting their works to deliver. But what we've seen now as we've kind of coming out of the pandemic is that this trust issue is starting to re-emerge, and that organisations that are maybe not as culturally mature are worried about whether workers are productive or not. And therefore are starting to look at this monitoring technology to see when they're logging in, to see when they're logging out, to see how many keystrokes they're doing a second. And that's fundamentally undermining trust. And the implication for that is that it causes work-related stress and other work-related mental health problems. You know, if you feel like you're constantly being watched, then that's going to create anxiety. So actually, there are really significant issues with the use of this technology from a psychological health and safety point of view. And also questions around, you know, how the data is being used, and particularly a lot of this data might be capturing health data. David's reflected on kind of data more generally, but if this is health data, you know, how is your organization using that? Are they making assumptions about your ability to work or continued work? You know, is performance management suddenly going to be related to what your heart rate is from the technology that's being used? You know, there are really fundamental questions that will have serious implications from a psychological health and safety point of view that need to be considered as part of this discussion.
If I could just add to that, Kate, once you start to put those data sets together, this becomes personal identifiable information, and you've got to look at legal compliance there with, you know, data protection. So it becomes a legal risk as well. Now, again, we don't want to frighten everybody off here, but what we're saying is you've got obviously the welfare of the workers as that priority, but also looking at that legal compliance becomes a major issue. So all of these things need to be considered up front and addressed. I'm not saying don't do it, but certainly when it comes to legal compliance, you've seen, you know, GDPR fines in hundreds of millions. You know, this is the thing that will hopefully help grab the attention of senior management when it comes to these kind of policies, to actually support the welfare of the workers, to make sure that it is being managed correctly.
And I think that that's a really good point. You know, David talked about GDPR, but you know, legal compliance around health data is already in place. You know, there is health data that you need to keep for, say, 40 years in the UK. So what are the systems? You know, so what data is being captured? How are you keeping that secure? But what are your processes then for keeping that data and making sure it's accessible for that time frame from a legal compliance point of view?
Thank you, Bruce. I think, again, that leads quite well into our next question, if we can go to the next slide. The next question we are looking at is, how can these technologies contribute to sustainable workplaces? And I guess there's a few ways to think about sustainability in this question, but maybe if we stick with what Kate and David have just kind of outlined in the previous slide, from a sustainable employability kind of perspective, that level of data and insights, how could that possibly contribute to the well-being of staff, or the culture of the workplace and longevity of staff, things like that? Maybe Kate first.
Oh, so that's a really big question, isn't it? So I think, you know, David said about the data that can be captured from this and the insights that can be provided. So I think there's a number of ways that you can start to think about this technology. If you think about using some of this technology to monitor heating within a workplace, for instance. So one of the things that I think is quite exciting is that as heating systems become smarter, there's an ability for individuals to regulate the temperature in their spaces. So you've got kind of factors that you're only heating areas where there are people. So from a sustainable point of view, you're reducing energy, but from a well-being point of view, you're also allowing that individual climate control to meet individual needs. And we are all different in terms of our needs around, you know, climate control. So in terms of creating a workplace that is more individually tailored for the individual, that becomes something that is really, I think, exciting, actually. And that helps then maintain that well-being, that engagement point of view. I think, again, some of the insights that can be gained from the data become better at predictive risk. So actually thinking about the nature of harm that can be caused, whether that is physical or physical health or mental health, and starting to take actions to address that. So air quality is a good example within a workplace where there may be issues, but also, you know, that I think some of the noise related indications, and I haven't seen this yet, but where we start to have different forms of technology communicate with each other. So where we've got smart PPE that is monitoring noise levels within an organization, if then that's then connected to BIM systems, then what you start to get is a really accurate profile of noise risk within an organization or a workplace, and then therefore you can start to come up with much more robust preventative measures around noise and noise induced hearing loss. So I think there are lots of, you know, exciting opportunities here. And I think from one of the things we talk about from an occupational health and safety point of view is sustainable employability. And this is a term that's particularly being used in Europe. And this is really thinking about the life cycle of the worker. So from the point at which they start to the point at which they retire, and how you can start to adapt the way they work, look at their needs, make reasonable adjustments against that. And technology has a really exciting role to play in that, to help us, again, from a data-driven point of view, understand what that looks like and what can be done. And I think in terms of thinking about particularly upskilling workers, and there is a challenge. We've got multi-generational workforce, and at one end we've got sort of digital natives who are living and breathing digital technology day in and day out, and then across the spectrum we've got people who are less and less comfortable with the use of digital technology or how it's being used. We need to ensure, and Chris made the point, education. How are we engaging workforces in this? How are we ensuring that they are upskilled to understand how this technology is there to help them, and how that can help them in their career life cycle?
Great, thank you very much for that answer, Kate. I might hand to Chris now. Was there anything you wanted to pick up on from Kate's answer, or anything, any thoughts to add on this question?
No, I think Kate's absolutely spot on in what she was talking about. I've always found that keeping a workforce, a sustainable workforce, is really important without a shadow of a doubt. And I go back to my experiences really around just generalised, safety helmets and PPE. And I've always said, does a person feel valued in a £7.50 safety helmet with no education as to why they're wearing it, as opposed to someone that's wearing a £40 or £50 safety helmet that's super comfortable and has been given education and understands exactly why they're wearing it and everything else. So definitely, I'd like to see, technologies that support sustaining the workforce without a shadow of a doubt, but it does all start with getting your workforce educated and being able to understand the importance of these technologies and what they should do. And exactly like Kate said, we had a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions around, say, the cleaning of PPE during COVID-19 for obvious reasons. And there was a lot of people that were out there, saying you should use this and you should use that. And ultimately, there was no education around the understanding of what's exactly right to use and what's totally wrong to use in terms of cleaning. So I would definitely support technology, and I would absolutely 100% support technology that actually then thought about sustaining the workforce and educating the workforce and getting them to understand why they're wearing the technology without a shadow of a doubt. But currently at the moment it's just not there. You go onto a building site, I come from the building trade originally. You go onto a building site, you sat in front of an induction, it just sort of plays out. You should wear this, you should do this, you should do that. But there is which I understand, time wise, you can't be sort of spending too much time inducting people, but there's always that background education that seems to be missing. It's always very much a blanket, just general sort of run over what you should and shouldn't be doing. But ultimately, there's a lot more that people need to understand. And I think if people understand that, then you get a lot more buy-in around the wearing of obviously PPE, and in terms of this, obviously the wearing of smart PPE and the reasons behind it.
Thanks very much, Chris. I think it's clear from those two answers already that there is so much to consider when we think about sustainability and these kind of technologies. I want to go to Bryn next, and Kate touched on this in her answer around the kind of the product itself and the implications that might have for sustainability. So we saw a lot of it during COVID with face masks. the throwaway kind of approach to using some of those single-use PPE. What do you think, Bryn, as far as sustainability in the product context of things?
Yeah, but it's all interlinked, isn't it? It's you know, this throwaway society and the kind of attitude towards PPE is sometimes throwaway in its comments and throwaway in its kind of attitude until something goes wrong, right? And then, you know, everybody's extremely interested, and COVID-19 brought that to the absolute forefront. I've never had so many conversations about the importance of PPE with so many people who didn't really know what PPE was trying to achieve. So, you know, one thing I do agree in terms of sustainability before I come on the product is Chris's view of what we're saying here is that smarter PPE could potentially be reusable rather than single-use items that sometimes can be viewed in the context that they're set. That is, it's going to do everything that I want it to do in a very short space of time. I'm going to throw it away and I'm going to use the next one. Personalizing PPE, like anything, I guess, brings something to the table, and that is it's yours and you have to look after it. And therefore, do you have a bit more interest in what it's going to do for you and how it's going to protect you? And almost, do you then become the expert in your own PPE? And is that good for the worker, and is that good for the employer? You know, if we talk about that single-use approach, I mean, textile waste, for example, COVID is the second largest polluter in the world. And we haven't had one conversation about this throwaway society during that process, but it was at the forefront prior to the COVID pandemic. So reusable is top of the agenda in terms of our ability to look at life protection across the whole planet, right? So I think, look, one of the concerns is how do you dispose of this stuff at end of life, you know, and how do you manage its full circle of life? And I don't know, again, these questions seem to be these sometimes really far in the future and not based on agility. When mobile phones first came into society, there were huge concerns about the health risks and all of the risks. But it's moved to in my opinion, to more of a psychological risk of how is this affecting people's. But there's no doubt that these products have a benefit. What's happened is because these phones have become personalized to the user, people have become an extreme experts on how to use these products and the benefits and perhaps the risks and the downside to even be able to talk about it. So I think from a sustainability point of view, personalization is great. It increases education and awareness, and we can get away from potentially a more throwaway.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Bryn. We've covered a lot of ground already, and we are kind of approaching the end of our webinar. So we've got half an hour left, and I do want to make sure we get some time for audience questions at the end. So we'll move on to our next discussion question, if we can, on the next slide, which is bringing it back to standards development. So I'll ask Chris first, as someone who's been involved in standards development for traditional PPE, as well as some of the electrotechnical side of things. Where are the standards at with this technology, and what are we seeing happening already?
Yeah, from a standards perspective, actually, obviously, the standards cover the product, and what I've found specifically is there's no interaction between the Smart PPE company, or very little interaction between the Smart PPE company and the manufacturer of the product that they're going to put it on. So from a standards perspective, you know, for me, obviously developing, helping to develop in 397 and 12492 and all of those sort of helmet standards, we always speak about compatibility. So we always speak about, you know, if you add something to something, will it work? You know, does it work still in the same way? But as I said, I find very little interaction between, you know, the manufacturer of these products and the manufacturers of the product that it's being attached to. And I'd like personally to see, you know, a lot more interaction, because we need to be assured that if we add something to, say, as an example, you know, a helmet, like an indicator, or we add some near-field communication, like a device that tells us if we're getting sort of near a particular area that where there might be danger, we need to make sure that the helmet, say in question, would react exactly the same way as it would do ordinarily, as tested obviously to the standard. Now, working for manufacturers, as I have done before, this was called like an approval process. So this would be down to obviously the manufacturer to contact someone like the BSI, a notified body, and say, hey, look, we've got this manufacturer, they want to add something to our helmet. We need to make sure that it actually, you know, still goes through the rigorous testing that it does according to the standard. There are some companies out there that do, you know, approach the manufacturer and ask them to conduct that testing, or to contact, you know, in terms of the UK, the BSI, and make sure that the product still works. But there are a lot of companies developing these things that have no interaction actually with the manufacturer, and therefore with standards. So I'd like to, you know, see more manufacturers talking to each other, so we make sure that these things that people are putting on their heads or on their bodies are still working exactly the same way, even when you have added something to it. And we see this in lots of examples of not even just smart PPE, but also, say, hearing protection, where we have one company that will produce a very popular hearing protection that absolutely everyone loves, but they'll try and fit it to a different manufacturer's safety helmet, and it doesn't fit properly, but they'll shoehorn it and try and make it fit properly. And then the issue is, you know, does it still work correctly? Is it really doing the job that it should be doing? So there's all sorts of issues, and I know there is a lot of work going on in the background from a standards perspective, talking about compatibility and how we can encourage manufacturers to think more about how their devices not only work with their own PPE or their own manufacturer's equipment, but also other manufacturers' equipment. But of course, that is a very, very difficult thing, because you get, you know, a very large company that make a lot of money out of PPE. Do they necessarily want to make sure that their equipment works with another competitor's, you know, helmet or hearing protection? But I would say, look, for the benefit of the wearer and for the benefit of the user, and to make sure that they are safe, it is absolutely imperative that we make sure that whatever we're adding to a piece of PPE, that it still works in the correct manner and still gives the correct level of protection. And that is really, really important.
Thanks very much, Chris. I might go to Bryn next. We touched on it earlier in the webinar from a kind of a certification and assurance point of view on what's already possible. Did you want to pick up on that as far as what's possible with standards at the moment?
Yeah, and again, all of this is from a pragmatic approach of agility of everything that we've discussed in here, and not if we looked at this as traditional standards and put it in the traditional standards route, smart PPE is 10 to 15 years away. When you start putting artificial intelligence into the pot, then you've got to define what artificial intelligence is in the context of smart PPE, and it goes on. This is not monitoring technology as we see it, like Kate's design. We're talking about traditional PPE. So look, there is some green shoots, but there's a warning. And I think the warning is that we could potentially scare ourselves out of a huge benefit here for society. Large organisations, as we all know, are concentrating on market share, and PPE products are becoming ever more competitive in a really mature world. They're lighter, stronger, faster. But essentially, some of those products will, in the end, claim whether they are doing the correct job. So, you know, why would large manufacturers want to invest in all of this disruption to produce products that are at start really, really expensive and allow new competitors to come into the market? That's the risk question. Although large organisations are really, really interested in all the benefits and developments of Smart PPE. But as we stand in all of this conversation, there is no go-to position for trust and assurance. And most of the people that bring Smart PPE products up are innovators or disruptors. And we know that markets work with innovators and disruptors. Then it comes together and there's some sort of consolidation or acquisition, and then it becomes a real feature. So in terms of Smart PPE as a product, we already have the PPE regulations. So when it comes to some of the fundamental questions of how this product needs to act, we've got the PPE regs to rely on. And the PPE regs are constantly updated to reflect that. I think if you look at testing in a traditional prospect, notified and approved bodies have all of the means of testing products for the following standards after the PPE regs. And now we have a new position where there are organisations such as BSI who can offer that assurance and trust in terms of the Internet of Things and IoT. That's readily available now. So what we've got to think of ourselves is when we have the challenge to look at these products, to give them market access, to prove the claims that they're making, then how can you challenge us as an organisation to support that journey? So that's the kind of go-to position of where standards are. There are committees in Europe actually looking at Smart PPE particular products and looking at wearable technologies and particular products. But again, it's about that speed.
Thank you very much, Bryn. I think we have time for one more discussion question before we get into some audience questions.
So, sorry, if I can just one point from the digital perspective. The standards are there for the security, privacy right now. But we've seen organizations come to us with first off products saying, what do I need to do to place it on the market? Oh, security. Do I need this? No, then I'm not going to do it. I just want the bare minimum. What we've seen change though is there's now the radio equipment, basically the whole RED directive, radio equipment directive, now includes cybersecurity. So any device that uses Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or anything like that now, it then has a cybersecurity imperative now in Europe. And what's really great is the standards that points to are well-established standards around industrial cybersecurity that cover all aspects from the product through to the overall integration. So now the standards are there, and there is no excuse whatsoever for Smart PPE manufacturers to ignore security and to bring products to the market without addressing that factor. So now, Bryn, that has been such a key development now. I think that there's a really positive way forward for addressing security. Sorry,
and the last point on that, David, the last point is absolutely clear. There are Smart PPE products in the market at the moment who are claiming traditional results within PPE. So they're selling it as PPE. So to actually give them that enhanced claims that they actually woke up in the morning to provide, I think we are in a clear position to be challenged on that now and try to support it.
Thanks very much, both for that. Thanks, David, for adding that. And if we do go to the next slide now, which is about kind of practical tips, which I think we kind of started to move into this territory with that discussion then. But I would like to leave listeners with kind of a practical mindset going forward, because we have talked about a lot of different things today. We've covered a lot of territory on this subject. So this last question, what should organizations do to identify and embrace Smart PPE and digital monitoring technologies, the ones that are right for them? So if we can, I think we'll go to each panelist and just ask for one actionable point for our listeners to take away today. So if we could start with Kate.
So I think it's about ensuring that you've got the basics covered. You know, we've heard throughout this session that, you know, personal protective equipment is there for a reason. It's at the end of the hierarchy of controls. So actually, what are you doing to prevent the risks before you are having to rely on personal protective equipment? And when you are needing personal protective equipment, are you choosing the right equipment that is going to offer that protection and is suitable for the wearer? You know, I think one of the challenges we see constantly with the conversations around technology and digitization is FOMO, this fear of missing out. And there's such a concern that we need to be using this technology. If we don't use this technology, we're going to be behind our competitors, we're going to miss out on an opportunity. Actually, when we're talking about occupational health and safety, the basic risks are still there, and that's what we need to focus on. What are we doing to ensure physical safety? What are we doing to ensure health, and particularly in the context of personal protective equipment, respiratory health, noise-induced hearing loss, you know, dermatitis? These are still really significant issues. So have you got that right? Have you got the basics right? Are you using the right PPE, the right controls before even considering the smart element of this? And I think relatedly, it's really important to consider psychological health and safety. You know, where people are exposed to a risk, particularly to their personal safety or their personal health, they will be anxious and worried about the implications of that. Add in what we've already talked about in terms of people's concern about how their data is being used, how they are being monitored, then those implications for work-related stress, anxiety and depression are significant. And, you know, just coming back to the last questions, there are already 2 standards that are available to organisations to help ensure that you're implementing best practice: 45001 for occupational health and safety management systems, and ISO 45003 for psychological health and safety. So I think before you kind of go down around the magic roundabout perhaps of technology, have you got the basics right?
Thank you very much, Kate. David, if we could go to you next for one actionable point.
The one actionable point here for me, we've talked a bit about education, but I think it goes slightly beyond that: collaboration. And that's from the manufacturers, the integrators, the specifiers and the users, understanding everyone together, every one of those, the actual user, the organization that's making them use the PPE, the integrator, the manufacturer. Collaboration across the key stakeholder groups is absolutely key to make sure that, as Kate said, all the basics are addressed, and as Bryn said, a pragmatic way forward.
Thank you very much, David. And Chris?
Yeah, great comments from Kate and David there, without a shadow of a doubt. Certainly things I would just say, you know, make sure it is the right thing for you and it does the thing that you want it to do. But don't forget the basics, you know, get all of everything else right first before you sort of start to stick your toes in the water. And please, yeah, remember that educational side of it. You know, it's really important to give your employees the reason why you're doing something, because keeping them informed and educated makes them feel better.
Definitely. Thank you, Chris. And last one from Bryn.
Just some simple points. For me, it's about being curious in this position, but find out more about the strategic benefits if you're an employer, about having traditional PPE with potential data integrated in it and how that can bring safety to your environment. And as a person wearing PPE, be curious about what is it your personal safety issues are and how can you challenge your employer or challenge those stakeholders around to make your position at work an increasingly safe position.
Great, thank you all very much for those points. So I think we have time for maybe 2 questions before we close the webinar. If we could just go on to the next slide, please. And we thank you also to everyone who did submit questions throughout. That is very much appreciated. We had a few good ones on end of life and disposal, which we've touched on already. So the first question I'll put to our panel was around the design and manufacture stages. So the question is, smart tech in textiles-based articles needs to be cared for and maintained over its life to realize its full potential. How much of the care and maintenance aspects are being considered at design and manufacture stages? So I think this might be a good one to go to Chris to first. What do you think, Chris?
Yes, yeah, fantastic question. And the answer to that is, of course, you know, companies want their technology to last, but does it, you know, are they actually thinking of how it's going to be used actually out there, and the issues that it's actually going to face? And I would say currently there are quite a few companies that do really think about that, but there are also a lot of companies that have developed a tech and then have sort of found that it may do something else and have then shoehorned it to sort of move it across because it can do something else, but actually haven't quite figured out how it can do that. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of things there without a shadow of doubt, but I would say the majority of companies do actually think about, you know, the wear and care side of it. But as we've always said, and I've probably said it far too many times in these conversations, you know, education is key. So those companies, you know, that do manufacture that particular item that is into PPE, to make sure that their customer that they've dealt with is aware of how it needs to be upkept and what needs to be done to make sure it keeps working and keeps working properly.
Chris, could I just build on that again and maybe bring in some experience from other industries that I think in this one we could learn from? Because this also addresses to a certain extent that cost issue as well. What we've seen in other sectors is bringing the connectivity in and the smart part in as part of going back to that as a service model. So rather than buying a piece of smart PPE, you buy the capability as a service and push down the supply chain, the ownership for designing it to be supportable, because the supply chain bears the cost. And that means it doesn't become a significant initial capital investment. It then becomes an operational cost with the onus put on the supply chain to make sure it is sustainable, usable, etc. So that's a model that used elsewhere that I know within PPE there is still quite a lot of that, you know, just supplying stuff as a service. But when we bring in that smart technology, forcing the supply chain on the smart side to do the same can help reduce some of the initial cost and put the onus on that supply chain to make sure it's sustainable. So maybe a lesson to learn there from other sectors.
Thank you, David. And Bryn, did you have anything you wanted to add on that question?
No, just again from a simplistic point of view, there are a number of data-led things that are already in garments that are going through commercial laundries at high temperatures, and they're still giving the data that was initially being supported. So things like RFID chips are being used in commercial laundries as they are. So, you know, cleaning and maintaining and wearing is again back to that point of reusable. So, you know, that whole reusable environment needs a huge education, and cleaning and management of those products is fundamental. But it's something that in my passing, manufacturers have absolutely considered. But, you know, until we have that drive in large organizations to go towards more sustainable products in reusable environments, single use, then, you know, you're always going to get overtaken by the demand for that single use.
Thank you, Bryn. And we've got a couple of minutes left, I think, to finish up with one more question. And there's quite a good one to end on, I think, that's come in. And that is, where is the best place to keep up with news and information on this subject. So panelists, do you have any advice for people who want to keep up to date? Might start with Chris.
Yeah, I'd always use Google. But it's no. I think ultimately, yeah, it's you can certainly speak to obviously manufacturers, as in manufacturers of particular products, and they'll always obviously keep you updated, or check manufacturers' websites, and they'll keep you updated of sort of smart technologies and smart PPE. Of course, there's always exhibitions, PPE exhibitions, which are obviously you have a lot of smart technologies that are actually there as well. So we have one next year, which is the biggest in the world, which is A+A. It's over in Dusseldorf, so it might be a bit far for some people to travel, but they certainly not only obviously have a lot of PPE, but they have a lot of safety systems, a lot of OH&S stuff, but also a lot of smart PPE or smart systems as well. So certainly that's probably sort of your best port of calls, but just keep your ear to the ground and just, you know, look out. There are a lot of technologies that are actually out there already, but there are a lot of technologies that are also up and coming.
And I think, again, from our position, you know, certainly within life protection, within BSI, is, you know, keep within our pages, follow me on LinkedIn. You know, I really am looking to become the part of the thought leadership for this. I'm encouraging people to contact us with their stories, with their challenges, so that we can create some environment of purely thought leadership to discuss some of the heavier issues and maybe get that traction going.
Building on from that, Bryn, what we've done elsewhere, there's one project going on right now in digital healthcare, is we can basically bring those key stakeholders together, and where there is a key issue to be addressed, look at what is the existing best practice there, pull together some agreeable framework and get some consensus from the industry, from all the stakeholder groups, on how to move forward. Sometimes it might be creating a new standard, but most of the time it's recognizing what's there already and putting it together in a framework that's consensus based, can be used by everybody, and move that forward. And that's something, you know, from the assurance side, Bryn and I, you know, will be looking to do. So if it's an area you're interested in, do reach out to us, and we can look to say, okay, what can we do to bring everyone together, address some of these issues, and enable better products to come forward in a way that is smart, secure, and sustainable. That's what we're here to do.
Excellent.
I think I just add, in terms of thinking about trusted sources, you know, as we've done today, you know, BSI is at the forefront of these conversations, looking at what's coming through, looking at what's being discussed, you know, so we've always got updates on a whole range of subjects. So I think, you know, that's a great starting point. But I think particularly in this area, it's also worth considering what research is going on, and looking at things like the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health and their research fund, and what research they're doing, what research is being done by the HSE. So for instance, there's some very interesting research that's been looked at the use of virtual reality training, but connected with sensors, so for fire safety training, so gloves that warm up, so for fire safety scenarios. And I think when, you know, Bryn made the point about use case, when you're looking to see, you know, whether this technology is effective, whether you think it's going to be meaningful for your organization, there's already activity going on that is exploring this from an academic research point of view. So that independent view about, actually, does this technology give the performance improvements or health and safety improvements that we're looking for, or is it all just smoke and mirrors?
Thank you very much all for those answers. Really helpful, and lots to go on for everyone who tuned in today. We do have to bring it to a close. There are just a couple of things from me before we finish up. So as I mentioned at the start, I am the committee manager for BSI's committee HS1. That's the Committee for Occupational Health and Safety Management. If you're interested in being involved in standards development, do reach out. My contact details are on the screen there. And we did mention 45,001 as well as 45,003 along the way today. So there is a link there if you want to find out more about those standards. And if we just go on to the final slide for today, I would just like to say a very, very big thank you to our 4 panelists for coming along today and for sharing so much knowledge. We had lots of questions and lots of really good information and things to think about. So thank you very much, panelists. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Really hope you enjoyed the session. Just a quick reminder that there will be an event survey to follow, so please do let us know what you thought. Feedback very welcome. And we did get to some of the questions throughout, but for those ones that were unanswered, we will endeavour to answer those and send them out as well. As I said at the start, this is the first of 3 webinars for today. The next one is starting at 1 p.m. And it's on preventing and managing infectious diseases at work. So it'll be a really interesting session as well. So I might see some of you there as well. So for everyone else, have a very good day and thank you again.